Welcome to our 16th podcast of Renew Your Mind. We're in the middle of a series on the origins of Methodism, and today we have Senior Pastor Paul Gruenberg, and we have our youth and family pastor, Jordan Chambers, and you have myself, Dana Hall, as a moderator. So we left off at the last podcast. We were talking about Wesley's renewal. And we mentioned his experience that he had at Aldersgate, and we were chatting after the podcast, and Pastor Paul mentioned that John Wesley was at an age of 35, and we wanted to start with that and go into the impact of, here's this 35-year-old Anglican priest, and then what happened? Where did he go next? Pastor Paul?
So one of the interesting things for me as I was thinking about that was that Wesley was actually 35 years old before he had his heart strangely warmed, before he had his experience of assurance of his salvation. And yet Wesley was a professor of Greek and philosophy at Oxford. He was in a holy club. And the question we asked Dr. Watson on our spiritual emphasis weekend a few weekends ago was Wesley saved, or was it after he had his Aldersgate experience? And he felt pretty comfortable saying Wesley was saved early on. Mm-hmm. And yet, when I think in regard to today's communities, there are a lot of people walking around who may have accepted Jesus as their Savior. They believe in Jesus as the Son of God, and yet they've not moved on beyond that, I guess, stated relationship. Mm-hmm. I know Jesus. I've read the Bible. I hear that sometimes. Well, I've read the Bible, and I know Jesus is God, but it's not a growing relationship. It's a very stagnant relationship. Mm-hmm. And that's not a healthy place for anyone who calls themselves a Christian to be. Mm-hmm.
Wesley had a strong base of knowledge and application of knowledge, and even a strong process of growing in knowledge. Where he didn't have strong base was in his faith. Mm-hmm. And he was not confident. He didn't believe certain things. He relied on the systems, on the processes. He relied on the things in which he was taught, but he didn't rely on just to put it plainly, the faith in Christ.
Do you think that he didn't rely on it because he didn't put the time towards that part of his faith? No,
because you think yourself, when you're in a small group or you go to Bible college, you have that, there's a lot of emphasis on putting your time. And he had put most of his life into, he was a missionary, for Pete's sake. Mm-hmm. He went all the way across, spending, like you said, several months journey to a new land, a colony of slaves and prisoners, and a place of Native Americans. He was in a very foreign area, right, doing God's work, if you will, and yet he himself, while he was there ministering, didn't have the faith that he was preaching. And he mentioned that himself in his own writings. It's very easy, even today, for us to go through the motions of Christianity without having the sincerity of heart. And knowledge, I believe, is a requirement. There are some things you have to know,
sure,
to be a Christian. But even more so, there are some things you have to believe, and they have to be the basis of your life. Mm-hmm. The core of Christianity is faith. It's not knowledge. Knowledge does come into play, but real Christianity is enacted, shown by faith. You're talking about studying James with your group, and I'm sure that you guys will have this discussion, in that if you don't have faith, it doesn't matter what you do. It's meaningless.
The reason why I asked that question is a lot of people in the world don't have faith. Mm-hmm. So I think I can relate really well with John Wesley.
There's probably a various amount of reasons, especially now.
But
you know,
you
maybe
know what
not
I'm
necessarily
saying?
for his reasons. Maybe it's, you know, you might have the same symptom that you don't have enough faith. For him, it might have been because of this, but for us, it might be because of this. The problem still remains, though. There's a lot of
Right.
faithless Christians in the world.
Right. And so with Wesley, he would take the words of Christ from John, and he begins talking about sanctification, about becoming holy. That's what the Holy Club was about, was becoming sanctified. And Jesus uses those words in John, I think it's chapter 17, about becoming more sanctified. And that's a process that happens. It's not a moment of sanctification. It's a process of growing. I mean, you look at some of the, I guess for me, sports is always high up, but you look at someone like I'll say the word, Matthew Stafford, or the name. He is a great quarterback. He can throw the ball. He can wing it. They call him a gunslinger with the football. He can do all sorts of things. But he can't get the Lions to win by himself.
Yeah.
It has to happen within the group, right? The team concept. And so he can be a leader on the team, but the whole team is not going to move forward unless it moves forward together. And Wesley talked about sanctification as a process of social holiness, which is a term that I think has been misconstrued more recently. Social holiness has this feeling of justice issues. It could be racial, it could be compensation, it could be whatever it is. It's a justice issue, but that's not how Wesley used social holiness. Social holiness to him was a group of people socially, right? A small group growing and becoming more sanctified together. It wasn't about peace and justice issues like a lot of people use that term today about social holiness, but social holiness is about us growing in community together toward a deeper relationship with Christ. And so I found that really interesting, that as we talk about salvation, or as we talk about sanctification, that Wesley saw that as a part of the package of grace that God pours out into our everyday life. And one of the distinctives about Wesley was how he didn't really create anything new. He just packaged what was already understood a little bit differently so we could understand it. And we call it grace, God's grace. And Wesley had 3 or 4 terms that he used in how God's grace is displayed to the people.
Yeah, we were talking about it earlier, and it's maybe instead of how they're displayed, it's more like when.
When.
Because it's the concept that God's grace is always and ever present, and depending on your stage in your life, you might see it differently, or it might impact you differently.
Right.
The prevenient grace, that which comes before, is grace which impacts you, which seeks after you, which provides mercy for you even before you've considered Christ.
I was taught that prevenient grace is that grace that draws you to Christ. It's the wooing of God.
Yeah. And he's got, like I said, these 3 or 4 different not versions, but these different categories or terms for grace
at different points in time.
Yeah, it all
life.
reflects depending on your stage of where you are spiritually. But nonetheless, it is grace that is the core and the concept of salvation and of sanctification, of both meeting Christ and growing in Him. And how far you grow and when you start that process, or if you start that process, much of it relies on your response to God's ever-present grace. I think of a good way to understand this is if grace were like on a bar, like if you think of a chart with the bar charts, and grace was just at the peak, your response level is the bar that's beside it. And if your bar meets a certain spot, then it's at this point. If it meets this point, then it's at this point. The grace is always maxed out, present right there. But it's up to you how much you're going to respond to the work of God, which has already been done and is being done all the time. And that's, a heavy, I think, impact on John Wesley. And we talked about how he was 35 when he realized some of this. He had been experiencing much of this beforehand, but he hadn't really experienced it in himself to the extent where he was confident. And that's a very common thing, but grace was always there. It wasn't because God wasn't working his life. It wasn't because God wasn't providing for him. It was because he wasn't responding or seeing those things.
Right.
His eyes need to be open. Really, it was more like he just needed to open his eyes to the truth that was always there.
And so the second timing of grace, or the second coming of grace, once a person is wooed by God, this prevenient grace, is not a new term in the Christian world at that point in time, because Luther coined the phrase justification, that grace that is present when a person makes a decision for Christ. Justifying grace is, the term I've always heard is just as if I've never sinned. It's that grace that covers us at that moment when we receive Christ, and we are created new creatures. The old is gone, the new has come. And so that's justifying grace. And then the third grace occurs after that, and that's sanctifying grace.
And what's the first grace?
Prevenient or preventing grace.
And the second grace is
Justification.
Okay.
Or justifying grace.
All right. So how did that differ from the church that John Wesley grew up in?
Justifying grace was always, I think, present, at least from the time of Luther, as a term, as a processed term. Sanctifying grace, I don't know if that was present before Wesley or if Wesley coined the term. Actually, I think Jesus coined the term when he talked about in his prayer about sanctifying the disciples, sanctify them.
Yeah, you almost need to do an entire podcast on this, but in church history, where the doctrines that Wesley attributed to were not specifically ones that were popular amongst the rest of the Reformation. Calvinism and Lutheranism were the two main doctrines of salvation. That's a good way to put it. And how we interact with God and how God interacts with us. Both Lutheranism and Calvinism would suggest that God puts his grace on us and we can't really do anything about it. Whereas Wesley suggested that God provides his grace for everyone and we need to do something about it. And that was a very different concept. In the Church of England, and Wesley had some qualms, even though he wanted to stay with the Church of England. He had some qualms about Anglicanism. He like his previous ancestors, he thought the church needed to be cleaned up a bit. That it had some major problems, and included in their doctrines, and even on this issue. So he was a bit of an outlier in his day, because he was a part of a group, or he really started a group which relied upon the response and the choice of man, whereas most of the Protestant Reformation, they glorified the sovereignty of God to the point where they would say, man doesn't have much of a choice. God just makes it happen for you. And again, Wesley, even though he had some friends and preached alongside people that believed that, he had a very different view of how we interact with grace and how grace interacts with us. And that included with the church that he grew up in.
The interesting thing about that, when you talk about it, George Whitefield, I like how Dr. Watson put it, was the rock star preacher of the day. He said he would even preach to crowds of 30,000. This is without amplification of any kind. But he would preach, and he could lead people to Christ. He was the Billy Graham of the day. And yet in his last days before his death, he and Wesley were friends. They were a little bit at odds with each other in regard to some of the stuff that Jordan has just spoken about. But at the end, Whitefield said that Wesley did it right, that his movement was a rope of sand. Not that it wasn't important because it led people to Christ, but Wesley provided a method for people to grow in their relationship with Christ. And we talked about the class and bands last podcast. So if the rock star of Wesley's day would say, you know what, basically saying it's important to be a part of not just a movement, but to be a part of a group, to be part of a band, to be accountable to others for your spiritual growth, this social holiness that Wesley talked about. That if he said that, then it must have been important then, and it is still important today. Mm-hmm. And I guess we talked about barriers to being a part of a group. We just have to find a way. You know, there are men's group that meets at 6:30 in the morning because they know they need it, and yet they have to find time because they have families and work schedules, and women too. You know, oftentimes I see women meeting more in the evening. Mm-hmm. So it's maybe that give and take in a family relationship. But the problem with the Church of England, because Wesley initially wanted to bring renewal to the church, is they said, no, we're good where we're at. Mm-hmm. We don't want this stuff. And that's how the movement called Methodism began. Because what Wesley did for the church was rejected by the church. And the movement was so powerful that it wasn't going to stop. Mm-hmm. It was meeting the needs of the people, and people were growing in their relationship with God. And so through the group, people were actively pursuing sanctification, that grace that God pours out. They were wanting to be holy in their own lives. And again, it seems that the only way we can do this is within a committed group of people, social holiness. So it's just really interesting how that existed then and how the churches today are seeking that kind of a movement within them so that people will grow.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to wrap up this this podcast about that. And I made a note that one of our future podcasts should focus more on Reformation, and you kind of gave us a introduction to it, but yeah, I can see how we'd have quite a discussion on all of that history as well. So.
Much of modern Christianity is so blended with some of those movements. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of churches that are Calvinist with Methodist practices, or there's a lot of churches that have Arminian theology, but that have benefited off of the cultural stylings of men like Luther and Calvin. And we use so much off of the backs of these giants.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And we rarely understand what they were.
Yeah,
or
where they came from.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right, and it's not as though you have to follow one or the other in order to experience sanctification or to experience becoming more holy. One of the things Watson said was, again, Wesley didn't create anything that wasn't already there. He just put terms to it.
Yeah.
And, he drew his from
personality.
Luther.
Yeah. He took what he knew or what he was taught, and he gave people ways to put it in place. Yeah.
He was what today we would call people who are looking for best practices.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Let's make the best practice we can. And so, again, I really appreciate Wesley for that.
Yeah. Well, let's wrap up this podcast with that. Anything you either of you two want to share, up and coming events?
Actually, by the time you hear this, Advent is going to be just weeks away. Thanksgiving will be just weeks away. And just a reminder to love your family and to spend time with them and remind them that they are loved by you.
So
We do have some exciting events that we'll tell you more about in the Advent season that are in the works. So
Okay, that sounds great. So, again, we're with the First United Methodist Church of Gaylord, Michigan. We're located at 215 South Center, and our phone number is 989-732-5380 if you have any further questions for either of the pastors. And thank you again for joining us today.